I'd like to thank Ned Block and Dave Chalmers for doing me the honor of inviting me to speak at this conference. But I'm worried that the metaphysical reflections I am about to offer will seem to have little connection with the empirical research on consciousness that most of you are engaged in. I'm also keenly aware that a discussion as abstract as this may suffer from my very limited knowledge of the state of current research. So if what I have to say strikes you as too detached from or uninformed by what is known about the mind and the brain, feel free to blame Ned and Dave. I believe that the conceptual scheme of our natural language is dualistic. It distinguishes between mental and physical events and properties, and while recognizing that there are many systematic connections between them, clearly implies that they are never the same, that they are different in kind. Physical phenomena are part of the spatio-temporal order and can be observed by perception. Mental phenomena appear within the point of view of an individual subject and cannot be perceived from outside by another subject, whereas physical objects and physical phenomena don't have a point of view. This conceptual dualism is the basis for a philosophical argument for metaphysical dualism. It goes back to Descartes. We can clearly conceive of the body existing without a mind, or the mind existing without a body. We can clearly conceive of a physical organism behaviorally, physiologically, and chemically indistinguishable from you or me, but which nevertheless has no inner subjective mental life, a zombie in the technical philosophical sense. If we take what is clearly conceivable to be evidence of what is possible, this seems to show that one of them really could exist without the other. And that means that in an ordinary human being, the mental is something in addition to the physical and not identical with any part of it. Whether it is an additional thing or just an additional set of properties is a further question. This metaphysical dualism has been strenuously resisted, mostly by denying the conceptual dualism from which it derives. In different ways, philosophers in an analytic tradition that includes Gilbert Ryle, J.J.C. Smart, Hilary Putnam, and many others have tried to show that the surface appearance of our mental concepts is misleading, and that proper analysis will show that they don't imply the existence of anything that is not part of the physical world. All these candidate analyses involve some kind of reduction of the mental to the physical, either defining mental concepts in terms of behavioral dispositions or in terms of so-called functional role, by which is meant the typical place of a type of mental state in a complex causal network of internal states responsible for regulating the organism's interaction with the environment. Or else offering not a definition, but an account of the publicly observable conditions under which we employ mental concepts, the behavioral and circumstantial criteria for their application or assertion in ordinary language. If a reductionist analysis of this kind were successful, it would show that the thought that we can conceive of the mind without the body or of a philosophical zombie is an illusion, since that is not conceptually possible. But I believe all such analyses fail because there simply is no contradiction between an organism's satisfying any behavioral, functional, physiological, or chemical description, however elaborate, and it's having no inner consciousness at all. And the feature that is not entailed by any purely physical or behavioral or functional analysis is the irreducible subjectivity of consciousness, what it feels like from the point of view of the subject to be in such a state. But in spite of being convinced of this conceptual irreducibility, I still want to resist dualism. Not only Cartesian substance dualism with its separate soul, but also property dualism, according to which conscious living organisms have mental properties and states that are distinct from all their physical properties and states. I suspect that in spite of what our natural language concepts seem to imply, the truth, the truth lies in some form of monism. More specifically, I suspect that conscious mental properties and their neurophysiological conditions are not distinct, but are inseparable aspects of some one thing for which we do not at present have a concept, but which our natural mental and physical concepts represent incompletely and inadequately. This is a position with a long philosophical history, going back to Spinoza. It is sometimes called neutral monism, sometimes dual aspect theory. It would mean that the conceivability argument for dualism fails because although the relation between the mind, the mental, and the physical is in fact necessary, our incomplete concepts make it seem contingent. The hypothesis of metaphysical as opposed to conceptual monism seems empirically attractive. Our knowledge of the empirical relations between consciousness and the brain is only at its beginnings, but it seems natural to assume that nothing happens in consciousness without physical conditions, and that the relations are systematic. Whenever we observe such systematic correlations in nature, it's natural to speculate about the possibility of a deeper connection based on a better understanding of the true nature of the phenomena that seem distinct. Of course, if, as I believe, our present concepts are still dualistic, empirical research on the relations between consciousness and the brain will remain dualistic in form for the foreseeable future. That is, it will be research on the objective neurophysiological or functional conditions of subjective mental phenomena. But I think it is reasonable at the same time to have in the back of our minds the idea that a true theory may require the transcendence or extension of our present concepts of the mental and the physical as part of a new type of explanation which reveals the most basic relations between them to be not contingent, but necessary. I want to try to say what this would mean and how having in mind the possibility of such a theory might indicate directions of research. But the question with which I'll be primarily occupied is whether the idea makes any sense at all. The idea of a property or state that is necessarily both mental and physical can't be created by definition. That is, an X that is both mental and physical. That would be just a verbal creation and wouldn't imply that the two conjuncts couldn't exist separately. The concept could only be introduced as part of an explanatory theory that revealed the non-contingency of the connection. We have examples of this in the physical sciences. The correlation between temperature and pressure of a gas at constant volume turns out to be not a contingent relation between two distinct properties, but a necessary truth in virtue of the deeper grounding of both temperature and pressure in the kinetic energy of the molecules of which the gas is composed. But of course, this macro to micro reduction within the physical domain cannot serve as a model for the case of consciousness and the brain. Instead, we must be open to an identification of both the mental and the physical with something that is neither mental nor physical in the usual sense, but which necessarily has both of them as essential aspects. I believe such a concept could emerge only through the method of inference to the best explanation, where the explanandum, what is to be explained, includes both the mental and the physical and the systematic correlations between them, a theory of an expanded natural order. This is all very abstract, but let me, in the same speculative vein, offer a guess about the type of necessary connection we might hope to discover. I have insisted that the familiar relations at the macro level between consciousness and physical inputs and behavioral outputs are contingent. But I believe that they can serve as a model for the deeper non-contingent relations between consciousness and neurophysiology. That is, by tracing inward to their source, the familiar observable psychophysical connections that are contingent because they are mediated by sense organs, sensory neurons, motor neurons, bones, muscles, tendons, and so forth, we will eventually reach connections that are no longer contingent because they are unmediated. In other words, I suggest that conscious experiences have something analogous to essential behavioral manifestations in the central nervous system, that they are just what the immediate causes of these manifestations feel like from the inside. This would be to take the form of what is to be explained as a clue to the form of the explanation, while at the same time coming to see regularities that appear contingent as based on something necessary at a deeper level. Take pain, for example. At the macroscopic level, it is typically caused by injury, causes behavioral avoidance, and operates as negative reinforcement. But all these connections depend on input and output pathways that are not among the necessary or sufficient physical conditions of pain. There is a central state, however, which is at the meeting point of these causes and effects, the terminus of the causes and the origin of the effects. And my suggestion is that it is a state that is not merely physical, but that has a subjective inside unique to this constellation of causal dispositions, which are its necessary physical expression. Or take the sensation of thirst, which is caused by dehydration and causes drinking, but only through the mediation of internal detectors for blood volume and concentration of interstitial fluid and of motor and perceptual pathways. Though these mediators are neither necessary nor sufficient conditions for the sensation itself. Yet the conditional dispositions at the level of the organism presumably have their basis in a central state whose dispositions are intrinsic to it. And the monism I am suggesting holds that the physical description of that state is incomplete because there is also something it feels like to be in it, of which these dispositions are the unmediated physical expression. The view is monistic because it holds that in such cases, the experience and the physical state are necessary and sufficient conditions of each other, but denies that either causes the other. Rather, the experience and the physical state have the same causes and effects because they are simply the inner and outer aspects of a single state, which is incompletely described by exclusively physical or exclusively mental concepts. I've been speaking loosely about mental and physical states, but in any serious theory, it would be better to think in terms of properties. Then the claim would be that the property of experiencing thirst is identical with some neurophysiological property of the organism, and the relation between the two is necessary because each of the two concepts picks out a single more fundamental property by a different non-contingent but incomplete description, one by its subjective mental aspect, the other by its objective physical aspect. It is worth noting the relation of this view to functionalism, with which it shares structural features, even though functionalism is a reductionist theory usually proposed in defense of physicalism. Functionalism denies the irreducible subjectivity of consciousness by embracing a functional or causal behaviorist analysis of mental concepts. Neutral monism of the kind I am suggesting rejects any such conceptual reduction, but nevertheless makes use of something like the functionalist framework, not as a conceptual analysis, but as a set of familiar facts about the observable conditions and consequences of mental phenomena. These facts, which are a condition of the possibility of our having mental concepts in a public language, must be explained by any theory of the intrinsic nature of mental states. According to neutral monism, that nature is mental from the inside and physiological from the outside, and provides the ultimate explanation for the causal roles of mental states identified in functionalist theories. I believe it makes sense to hope for a theory of this type as a long-term ideal, because it would have the best chance of doing justice to the full range of facts about consciousness with which we are all familiar, all of which have to be explained together: the mental, the behavioral, and the neurophysiological. In particular, I believe it would be superior to a theory based on a metaphysics of property dualism, which would have to combine a neurophysiological account of physical behavior with a system of psychophysical laws that were either interactionist, causation in both directions between mental and physical properties, or epiphenomenalist, causation only of the mental by the physical, meaning that consciousness has no causal role, but is merely a side effect of the physical operation of the organism. Monism would allow us to hold on to the pre-theoretical idea that pain itself makes me avoid what causes it, and thirst itself motivates me to drink, without relying on contingent causal interactions between mental and physical properties in the core of the central nervous system. This is still very abstract. And I don't mean to suggest that I've made these monistic properties comprehensible. That could come only with the formulation of actual concepts of this type in the course of constructing an explanatory theory whose empirical confirmation provided evidence that such things exist. But I want to say a bit more about what such a theory might look like, and to address one question in particular. Would the states I'm imagining really be unified rather than raising again the question of the relation between their mental and physical aspects? This question requires us to distinguish the consequences of a property that are truly essential, revealing an internal, non-contingent relation, from those that are due to a merely contingent external relation. All our working concepts require that there be some form of generally available access to what they refer to. And that means that any concept of a type of process or substance or of a property, mental or physical, will refer to something that is systematically connected to other things, allowing different people from their different points of view to get a handle on it. This is true whether the property is liquidity or heat or painfulness. There are no natural kinds without systematic connections to other natural kinds. Sometimes the properties that permit us to make contact with a natural kind are external contingent properties. This, as I have said, is true of the ordinary behavioral manifestations of mental states that permit us to have public mental concepts. It is also true of some of the manifest properties by which we identify many other natural kinds. For example, our pre-scientific concept of water picks out the liquid that fills the rivers, lakes, and oceans and falls from the sky as rain. These are contingent properties of water. But the closer we get to the thing itself, the more unmediated will be its manifestations, its effects, and its relations to certain other things. Eventually, we arrive at effects that are directly entailed by the essential properties of the natural kind itself. The fact that water boils at a certain temperature and atmospheric pressure when heated is a necessary consequence of the molecular constitution of water and the fact that heat is a molecular kinetic energy. Or to take a more basic example, the mass and charge of a proton, without which it would not be a proton, have strict consequences for its behavior in relation to other particles similarly specified. The manifest properties of ordinary physical objects, their shape, size, weight, color, and texture, for example, already have necessary consequences for their interactions with other things whose properties are specified with sufficient precision. I wouldn't want to say that the properties are identical to these external relations, but the consequences are not merely contingent. An object simply would not weigh 1 pound if it did not affect a scale in the appropriate way, in the absence of countervailing forces. However varied may be the contexts in which a property or type of thing appears, we have to suppose these essential relations preserved in order to be sure we are talking about the same property or thing. Some dispositions are necessary consequences of a thing's essential nature. But all these connections at the gross level have implications for the type of analysis at the level of physical theory that can reveal more fully the intrinsic nature of such an object. An analysis in terms of microscopic components, however strange and sophisticated its form, must in some way preserve these external relations of the properties of the manifest object. However far we get from the manifest world of perception and common sense, that link must not be broken. Something similar is needed if our starting point is not the manifest world of inanimate physical objects, but the world of conscious creatures. In a case like thirst, for example, the subjective quality and the functional role are already connected in the way we ordinarily identify the phenomenon. It is a conscious state that typically has certain physical causes and behavioral manifestations, as well as other mental consequences. The full intrinsic character of the state has to be discovered, but the ordinary notion already contains in rough form an idea of the kind of state it is, just as an ordinary substance concept like water already contains in rough form an idea of the kind of thing it is, setting the possible paths to further detailed discovery of its true nature. In the case of water, those paths have led to the development of atomic physics and chemistry. What path is suggested if we start from embodied conscious states? The hypothesis of psychic atoms that are just like animals, only smaller, is not even a starter in this case, because we don't have a coherent idea of larger conscious subjects being composed of smaller ones, as the early atomists had the perfectly clear geometrical idea of larger physical objects or processes being composed of smaller ones. But the more abstract idea of a form of analysis of conscious organisms whose elements will preserve in stricter form the relation between mental reality and behavior could guide the development of a reductive theory in this domain. There must be some kind of strict inner-outer or subjective physical link at more basic levels that can account for the far looser and more complicated inner-outer link at the level of the organism. The idea would also have to include a completely new theory of composition of mental or psychophysical parts and wholes. The parts and wholes need not be just chunks of the brain and their smaller components, but could include more complex, extended processes and functions. My conjecture is that the familiar relation between conscious states and behavior, which permits us to have mental concepts, is a manifest but superficial and contingent version of the truth. That truth being that the active brain is the scene of a system of processes of a type more fundamental than either the mental or the physical, which combine to constitute both its physical and its experiential character. Each such sub-process is itself a version of a mental behavioral relation that is not contingent, but necessary because it is not mediated by anything in the way that ordinary behavior is mediated by bones, muscles, and tendons, for example. The combination of these postulated processes would entail at more complex levels, not only the observable behavior and functional organization, but the conscious mental life systematically related but not reducible to it. The aim would be to find a realization in the brain, not just of functional states, but of mental states in the full sense. And that means the realization must be both in itself physical and in itself mental. The reductive basis must preserve, in broad terms, the character of the processes being reduced. That is just as true here as it is in reductions of purely physical substances, processes, or forces. States of this kind, if they exist, could be identified only by theoretical inference. They would not be definable as the conjunction of independently identifiable mental and physical components, but would be understandable only as part of a theory that explains both and the relations between them. I leave aside the question of how far down these states might go. Perhaps they are emergent relative to the properties of atoms or molecules. But if they are not, this view would imply that the fundamental constituents of the world, out of which everything is composed, are neither physical nor mental, but something more basic. This position is not equivalent to panpsychism. Panpsychism is, in effect, dualism all the way down. This is monism all the way down. If we see the inferred monistic explanatory concept as a purification of the ordinary concept of mind, with the sources of contingency in the mental behavioral connections gradually removed as we close in on the thing itself, I think we can resist the objection that it doesn't have the true unity of a single property, that it is a mere conjunction of the experiential and the physiological. But I have to enter a large caveat in closing this extravagant exposition. I think we will have reason to believe in the truth of such a monistic theory only if the observable facts, both mental and physical, cannot be explained without appeal to such unified properties, or perhaps only if the best explanation must appeal to them. If it appears that there is an equally good explanation of the entire physical course of events associated with thirst or pain, for example, from physical causes to behavioral effects using only physical concepts and physical laws, then there would not be sufficient reason to regard neutral monism as more likely than property dualism, with mental phenomena being explained by epiphenomenalist psychophysical laws. So neutral monism is, I think, hostage to the fairly radical condition that subjective consciousness, or something more fundamental that entails consciousness, is essential to the explanation of behavior. Finally, I suspect the most promising place to start on this quest is with experiential affect, positive or negative, where the link with behavior is most direct. Mark Solms has recently made a persuasive case that the core of conscious experience is not perception or cognition, but affect. This means that affect, with its positive or negative valence, is sufficient for consciousness, and that when other mental functions, which can also operate unconsciously, are conscious, it is because they are enlisted in the service of affect. This suggests that if there is evidence for the kind of psychophysical monism that I think we should be looking for, it would appear in its purest form in cases of biologically based basic affect, bodily pleasure and pain, hunger and thirst, and their satisfaction, for example. What I have offered is pure speculation. To describe the logical characteristics of such a theory is not to produce it. That would require a conceptual creation in the context of discovery that makes conceivable what at present is inconceivable, a hidden necessary connection. But it won't be possible even to consider such a solution unless we have an incomplete conception of it in advance. And that requires the willingness to contemplate the idea of a single natural phenomenon that is in itself and necessarily both subjectively mental from the inside and objectively physical from the outside, just as we are.
All right, so your objection to functionalism was that it gives a conceptual analysis in terms of input and behavioral output. And you rightly rejected that. However, there is another way to think about functionalism, which is that our mental properties like thirst or pain are simply identical, not a priori, but are identical with functional roles. Now, of course, that would help your view, as far as I can see, in that it would automatically make the connection to behavior necessary. But of course, then those functional roles would have to be grounded in the monistic underlying reality that you were talking about. So that would be kind of a two-step version of your view. So what do you think of that?
I think your proposed non-conceptual functionalism, so far as I understand it, is still a physicalist theory, according to which, to be in pain is to be in a state that typically occupies a certain input-output role, completely physically described. And I think that even if it's not presented as a conceptual hypothesis, isn't good enough because it leaves out the irreducibly subjective element. And it means that a zombie, in the philosophical sense, would feel pain. And so that's why I would resist that as much. That's why I would resist that as much as I would resist the conceptually reductionist functionalism.
Yeah, okay.
So you were wanting to say that we know the neutral stuff only through theoretical inference and abduction, but I would have thought that whatever the neutral stuff is, it's going to be present in our own experiences, and we can get a grasp of it through our own experiences and constrain the possibilities for what the neutral stuff could be by introspecting our own experiences. So there were some things that you said that made it seem like the neutral stuff, whatever it is kind of mysterious. But I would think that one possibility would be to think of the neutral stuff as the qualities that are present in our own experience. And to think that there are also qualities present in physical stuff outside of our experience. So I guess I was wondering what you think about this kind of picture, where it's not just through theoretical inference and abduction that we come to grasp the neutral stuff, but it's also through introspection of our own experiences, because whatever the neutral stuff is, it must be there as well.
The trouble is that I think introspection seems to show us a domain of subjective experience that is completely independent, at least metaphysically, from anything physical. It doesn't, introspection doesn't reveal that my sensations might have any necessary connection with a physical state of my brain, even if it is likely that it is causally dependent on a physical state of my brain. I mean, these neutral properties that I'm speculating about aren't the kind of thing that introspection reveals, because I mean, this was Descartes' very persuasive thought, that in introspection, I have a complete grasp of what is going on in my mind. And I can see that it can't include anything physical. And I think that is an accurate account of our ordinary concepts, so that to discover that there is more to the mental than what is introspectively presented, there would have to be some kind of theoretical inference. Anyway, that's why I'm not persuaded that it could be introspectively revealed.
Okay, raise your hand if you have a question. Yes, Doris.
Your vision of a monistic theory that is also non-trivial, such that the current program of understanding how mental phenomena are implemented by the brain will be insufficient. And we need to bring in the idea that drinking is not just because of activation of thirst neurons in the hypothalamus connected to motor neurons, but it's due to the subjective feeling of thirst itself in some essential way. Does this vision imply that our current understanding of physical laws, simply as physical laws for explaining how matter changes over time, is insufficient?
Yes, it implies that if some kind of monism of the sort that I'm favoring is true, there are causal explanations which it would make possible that explain things that aren't explainable entirely by physical laws and physical explanations. That's it. So it is a radical proposal. I mean, I think that the question of how deterministic physics taken by itself is makes this not completely, doesn't rule this out completely. I mean, it seems to me it's a possibility, and that it makes sense to consider the possibility that our ordinary belief that experience actually plays a causal role in the generation of behavior in itself may be true. Yeah.
Okay, Anna.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. That was brilliant. And I would love to have had as much time as you had to think about all that. And being brought up by all these materialists around me, I might be a little bit brainwashed. So still, I'm having a problem. If I'm hearing you talking about intrinsic or essential properties, I feel very unsettled because I always think there are no essential properties. And all we can look for is something like family resemblance or go for disjunctive schemata and stuff like that. And so I would ask you to convince me about that there is something like an essential property, conceivable and theoretical, a good way to go.
Well, I mean, don't you think that negative charge is an essential property of an electron? No, you think there could be an electron that had positive charge? Or no charge? I don't. Do you think, don't you think it's an essential property of a human being that they have some spatial volume? I don't know. I can't do better.
Okay. Lenoble.
Thank you. Oh, thanks for this great talk. So I'm going to ask a simpler question than Doris. Does your theory allow for a conscious machine? The possibility of a conscious machine?
I mean, as a matter of pure logic, it would, but that depends really on the nature of the underlying neutral monistic properties that in our case manifest themselves experientially as sensations and so forth. Whether those properties are specifically limited to biological systems is an empirical question. I myself am very skeptical about the possibility of extending, conditions of consciousness beyond the biological home in which we now find them. And of course, I would resist an extension that depended on a purely functionalist analysis, but it's simply an open question whether the underlying basis of the mental physical connection is narrowly biological or not. So yes, as a matter of life. The answer is yes, as a purely philosophical matter, yes.
Okay, Johannes.
Thank you very much for the talk. It's wonderful. I was wondering how you would recommend to go about to do the experiments and thinking to come up with or to conceptualize the neutral or dual aspect properties?
I'm afraid, really, I'm too ignorant to give any answer to this question. I'm flattered that you would think I would have anything to say about it.
Okay, last one from Leonard.
In closing, you referred to some
Hello.
recent work of Mark Soames. I don't know his work, but a similar affect-centered view of the architecture of mind was suggested by the early utilitarians, especially by James Mill, to whom Jeremy Bentham delegated the working out of their psychology. According to James Mill, attention is organized always by pleasure or pain. These are interesting perceptions. They make a difference for us. That's why we care about them. And now, probably this is an overambitious theory, just as Kent Berridge in the past 30 years has dissociated desire or wanting, as he calls it, dopaminergic wanting, from hedonics. There are probably other attentional mechanisms that are non-hedonic. But what would you think of developing this view and looking for a mechanism of attention that is hedonic, that grabs attention and thus organizes conscious thought, and of looking at valenced perception and attention as a way to go forward?
Well, yes, that's a very interesting suggestion, and perhaps very likely you're right. I mean, I thought the main reason to focus on affect is that it's most likely to have the simplest and most immediate physical manifestations, whereas the physical manifestations or dispositions of other conscious states are likely to be more conditional and dependent on the operation of affect, which is, as you suggest, the driving force.
Okay, it's time to wrap up. Thank you very much, Tom.